This British mother is a wanted woman. Samantha Luwait was once cast as a victim, the pregnant wife of one of the suicide bombers who hit London in 2005. Intelligence sources say Samantha Luwait was now part of an East African-based terror cell. She became known as the White Widow. White Widow. White Widow.
How exactly did Samantha Luwait end up becoming the world's most wanted woman? Born in Northern Ireland in 1983, she moves back to England at an early age to settle in the relative comfort of suburban Aylesbury. An above-average pupil with high grades, she attends the Grange Secondary School. Apparently, she's heavily affected by her parents' marriage breakdown, and she seeks comfort in Islamic neighbors. She starts dressing in full traditional Islamic clothing. Whilst not being radicalized at the Grange Secondary School, it is there that she expresses a deep interest in Islam. Her ex-Northern Ireland soldier father and her Catholic mother don't seem to be too concerned by this development. Upon leaving secondary school, she spends 2 months at the School of African and Oriental Studies, otherwise known as SOAS, part of the University of London and long been suspected as a major MI5 recruiting ground. Roughly at the same time, she meets would-be suicide bomber Jermaine Lindsay, the most important moment in her life to date. No one can seem to agree on exactly how this woman met the father of her children. Was it at SOAS? Or was it in an internet chat room, maybe? Discussing the finer points of Islamic theology? Or perhaps it was on a march, an anti-war march? Now, you would have thought it would be a pretty straightforward question. Where did you meet your husband? Nobody knows the answer to this question. Or perhaps, what's more likely, there's a reason why we're not supposed to know the answer to that question. So who is this guy she ends up marrying? This would-be future suicide bomber who dies at age 19. Now, this guy's got a lot of aliases, but he's principally known as Jermaine Lindsay, also known as Abdullah Shahid Jamal. On one side, he looks like an Islamic fundamentalist. On the other side, he looks like a drug-dealing womanizer. Not exactly a perfect match for a suicide bomber. This is a picture of his mistress, Nikki Pope, who Samantha Luwait was terrified on the night before the bombings that he'd run off with, permanently. Now, who else do we know with a huge appetite for cocaine, women, strip bars, and suicide missions? I wonder. And of course, just like Atta, Lindsay was under heavy surveillance. In fact, his car was stopped 14 times in 2 years by the local police force. Every single time he was released without charge. And it seems he wasn't the only one with strange concerns the night prior to the bombings. Shahzad Tanweer, one of the other co-bombers, seemed to be far more concerned about talking his girlfriend into coming with him for a big night out in London. Hardly the actions of a would-be suicide bomber. Luwait's husband is very much the odd one out, but there's so little we really know about him for sure. Perhaps one of the more worrying aspects of information that's been released recently is Lindsay's apparent links to drug crime, specifically cocaine importation. Now, how does a 16 to 18-year-old Jamaican immigrant end up with a cocaine importation charge? Furthermore, witnesses have come forward saying that Lindsay was street dealing, both heroin and cocaine. Could it be possible that Lindsay was faced with a choice? Either work for the police or go to jail.
In the 24 hours after Robert Russell was extradited, police reported 56 hijackings, 17 bombings, 23 shooting incidents, and nearly 200 attacks on the security forces. In terms of the number of terrorist incidents, it's the worst the city has suffered since the violence at the time of the May's hunger strikes 7 years ago.
Welcome to the original war on terror, Northern Ireland. Complete with torture, suspension of law, people going missing in the night, protests, assassinations, car bombings, hunger strikes, total media censorship, black operations, and of course, black operatives. Now, we already know that Lewthwaite's father served in Northern Ireland, but what's more interesting is the fact that his area of expertise was anti-terrorism. Now, at this point in our story, we have to introduce another very strange link with Northern Ireland. This guy's called Martin McDade, also known as Abdullah Muhammad, and he went around telling anyone who would listen that he was an ex-member of the Special Boat Service. That's the United Kingdom version of Delta Forces. Witnesses have said that this is the guy who was the most vocal, the most aggressive, the guy who was pushing the other 3 bombers into taking some form of radical action. This is the guy, in my opinion, who provided the training, the weapons expertise, and the general encouragement and probably funding for the bombings that happened in London on July the 7th, 2005. And just like Samantha Lewthwaite, in 2007, he simply vanishes.
We are united in our resolve to confront and defeat this terrorism that is not an attack on one nation, but on all nations and on civilized people everywhere.
In the immediate aftermath of the bombings, Samantha Lewthwaite does not believe her husband could be capable of such an act. She demands to see the DNA evidence, which is a problem because despite all the other victims being identified, physical remains of her husband remain nowhere to be seen. In fact, it's not until 2 days later that the police come up with this evidence. When Lewthwaite is presented with the DNA evidence, she quickly changes her story and starts making numerous media appearances. For one story in the UK daily national tabloid, The Sun, she is paid approximately $50,000. A few weeks after the bombings, her house is burnt down and she is placed in what's known as police protective custody. We know practically nothing about the next 2 years, but in 2007, the security services give Lewthwaite the all clear. Accompanied by her 2 children and at least £30,000 richer, she boards a plane for the long flight to East Africa. So let's state some obvious facts here. First of all, she has at best limited knowledge of African languages. Also, it's highly unlikely that she can speak Arabic, which is the default international language for jihadists. So, here she is in Mombasa, Kenya, unable to speak the local language. She would have needed local contacts. She would have needed immediate local contacts on the ground to secure apartments, get food, travel about, and generally get organized. Regardless of trying to pin down her precise movements, what is known is she's rented property all over Kenya. In coastal resorts, in Nairobi, in Mombasa, in the countryside, in the suburbs, in the center of town. And in order to facilitate her movements, she needs fake identification. Which is how she nearly gets busted for the first time.
She came here and have a meal. We gave her kids biscuits. Yes. She said police met Samantha in this house.
And we should try and remember that she's now got 4 children with her. 4 children by 3 fathers. And we're supposed to believe that she can just flee at the drop of a hat. The Kenyan police do manage to figure out that she's traveling on a fake passport, head to her house and interview her, but she manages to convince them somehow that she's just a tourist. When they figure out their mistake and return to the house, she's vanished. In December of 2011, the Kenyan police arrest this guy in a house in Mombasa. His name is Jermaine Grant, a 29-year-old Jamaican immigrant to the United Kingdom, also known as Ali Mohammed Ibrahim. He quickly starts blabbing to the Kenyan police and probably elements of the American and British intelligence services. The person thereafter is Samantha Lewthwaite. She in fact is not only the leader of the terrorist cell, but also the banker or financer. In January of 2012, Lewthwaite herself narrowly escapes capture. An apartment that she's been renting under the name of Natalie Faye Webb is raided by the Kenyan police. Conveniently for the world's media, a treasure trove of documents is left behind. The way that these documents and letters have been slowly leaked out to the media makes me suspect that these are just plants to help create the myth. One example is the poem apparently found entitled Ode to Bin Laden. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. Or could you? And no, we're not going to read it out. Of course, there is another possibility here. It's the possibility that she simply isn't in Kenya at all. The whole thing is some kind of elaborate intelligence theater. This is what another so-called Islamic radical from Kenya had to say about Luthwaite and her movements in Kenya.
Nobody in Mombasa came across her except the anti-terror police unit. Nobody knows about her. Nobody has seen her. She's a myth.
We're supposed to believe that Luthwaite, dropping her kids off, I guess, at the babysitter's, is crossing the border into Somalia in order to link up with these guys, Al-Shabaab. One of the most violent places on earth and war-torn for centuries. This is the end of the yellow brick road for 20-something European jihadists. Into this chaos, we're led to believe that Luthwaite is somehow making friends. When the house in Mombasa gets busted, she flees with a guy called Habib Ghani. Where it gets slightly weird here is Ghani himself is killed by Al-Shabaab in September of 2013. So that's her second close male association that's ended in death. The whole idea of Samantha Luthwaite being actively involved in Somalia is stretching the imagination, to say the least. She would have to be accompanied at all times by a male. She'd probably never leave the house. So what is she really doing there? I mean, where is the evidence that she's even been there at all? And she spends a lot of time on the internet tweeting. It looks a lot more like someone sat in a Johannesburg apartment than someone on the front lines of Somalia. She takes self-portraits. There's a lot of references to Disneyland. Of course, the reality is that we've never really lost control of Somalia. Centuries it's been a foreign colony. 1 minute it's British Somaliland, the next minute it's Somalia. British Somaliland, Somalia. And if there were no groups like Al-Shabaab operating in Somalia, we would have to invent them. We'd have to invent them in order to continue this policy of chaos. It's more than likely that Al-Shabaab is nothing more than a way of us getting close to genuine insurgents, getting close to them and then eliminating them. If Luthwaite has been linked to Al-Shabaab, it makes it more likely, not less likely, that she is in fact a British agent. South Africa, Samantha Luthwaite's preferred chill-out zone. In South Africa, we can believe that Luthwaite would be undetectable. Living in a large city like Johannesburg with 4 mixed-race children, whilst it might raise eyebrows, would not be that unusual. And it is in South Africa that we have the most direct evidence for Luthwaite's presence in Africa. She's worked here. In fact, she worked as an IT consultant in a local halal pie factory. She's done her normal trick of renting apartments all over town. She's rented them in good areas and bad. She's also managed to rip off a few of the local banks, as well as running up huge store card debts. On top of all of that, she still managed to find time to have her 4th child. In this rather plush and very modern-looking birthing suite. Try as she might, she doesn't seem to be quite able to throw off all of her suburban Western background. And the problem I have is it all looks way too middle class and not very jihadist at all. Within South Africa's vast criminal underworld, she would have no problem finding fake identification either. This guy, Emmett Chisti, supplied her and about 3,000 other people with fake passports. he can't be too high up the food chain because he's now in jail, and he must have been very reasonably priced because she got a 2-for-1 on that day and decided to get one for her newborn son, Aaron Faye Webb. Armed with these passports, she's able to easily cross the border from Tanzania and into Kenya. This guy decides to go full medieval in central London, attempting to behead a soldier called Lee Rigby in broad daylight. Meet Michael Adebalejo, also known as Mujahid Abu Hamza. He's supposed to be linked with Lewthwaite through Somalia. They basically bumped into each other as you do on the yellow brick jihadi road. According to the Telegraph newspaper, there was a massive operation to get him off the Kenya-Somalia border. Why was this guy such a high-value target? Remember, this is before he did the beheading. It's speculation, but I've got an idea this guy was always working for MI5. Let's listen to what his family and friends have to say about the matter.
First they just ask him questions, then they obviously ask him if he would be a spy for them. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on a person, considering what he's been through. You'd expect maybe they'd say, oh, can you tell us about Kenya, can we do anything for you? But instead, you know, they basically pestered him for years.
And what was his reaction to being approached by the security service MI5?
Yeah, the situation was that, his wording was, Ak means brother, they're bugging me, like they just keep, they won't leave me alone, basically.
Did he explain what they wanted?
What he said is they asked him whether he'll be interested in working for them.
And we know that this is almost definitely true because immediately after this interview, that friend gets arrested by MI5. And this is Robert Lambert. In the 1980s, this police spy spent his time spying on what is known as domestic extremists and using the slightly ridiculous name of Robert Robinson. Now, he forms part of our story because his story helps to explain how Lewthwaite's role could well be that of an intelligence operative. Incredibly, this guy wasn't only just sleeping with the people he was supposed to be spying on, he was also having kids with them. This is the woman he had a baby with, and for a long time in the 1980s, she had no idea that he had another family. So there is this insane precedent. There are people right now probably doing exactly the same thing. So don't think it can't happen, or it hasn't happened, or it won't happen. This is the child they had together. And this is where it gets even weirder. Rather than being run out the country or jailed, unbelievably, this guy is now working in anti-terrorism. Not only is he working in anti-terrorism, he's working in anti-terrorism with inner city youth. For spying on people like you and me and having kids with them, he received the Order of the British Empire, otherwise known as the MBE.
We're checking for clowns. We need more clowns in this country, more clowns.
Meet Officer A. As an example of just how ridiculous and out of control things have got in the UK, this woman was using taxpayers' money to spy on the local group of protesting clowns. We don't know her real name. Of course, that didn't stop her from sleeping with the other clowns. This guy, Mark Kennedy, was doing pretty much the same thing. Using the undercover name of Mark Stone, he was running around all over Europe, joining in whatever protests he could find. Oh yes, and doing as many environmentally sound drugs that he could get his hands on. As well as sleeping with the people he's supposed to be spying on. For 7 years, from 2003 to 2010, he was another police spy leading a double life. Of course, he's now moved to America and is running a private surveillance company. Surprise, surprise. Also turns out that after he left the police force, he started working for the people he was once protesting against. Large international energy corporations. As a final tragic example of the lengths that the police and state will go to, this guy, Colin Stagg, was basically framed by the police in the early 90s for a high-profile murder case that he had nothing to do with. The police employed what's known as a honey trap, i.e. a female officer offering sex or the promise of sex in order to elicit some form of confession. The entire process was, of course, completely illegal, and the case was thrown out. So when we look at the case of Samantha Lewthwaite, we have to ask ourselves, could this be some sort of elaborate honey trap? Okay, so what are all these terrible deeds that she's been doing? Well, the first incident that she's alleged to be involved with is the Jericho bar bombing in June 2012.
The grenade attack in Mshomoroni took place as revelers thronged the Jericho Beer Garden to watch last evening's Euro Cup match between England and Italy. The pub, which is situated near a residential area, was packed, with many other revelers standing outside when the explosive devices were hurled.
Now, once again, we shouldn't read too much into this because throwing grenades in Kenya is kind of like throwing horseshoes in Texas. Everyone's doing it. This kind of thing's been going on for a very, very long time. 4 or 5 years of low-level destabilizing attacks in certain regions. Sometimes it's poor Somalis doing this, sometimes it's poor Kenyans. But let's have a look at the Jericho Beer Garden. I mean, it's not exactly the Hilton, is it? What is the point of bombing this place? You're only going to be killing your own potential supporters. The very same people that you're trying to get on side. Besides which, there are plenty of attractive targets throughout Kenya. Why pick this place? There's plenty of luxury hotels crammed with rich businessmen, Chinese investors, and foreign intelligence operatives to make perfect targets. But no, she decides to bomb a beer garden in a Mombasa ghetto. It just doesn't make any sense. And this is perhaps another sign that the story that we're being told isn't exactly the truth. Because there's no way a genuine insurgent would ever do this. Really, what we could be seeing is just a low-level destabilization program. A low-level destabilization program designed to install fear in both the local population and the government. It's unclear exactly what has been going on between China and the West in Kenya, but undoubtedly the West is trying to gain control of Kenya by any means necessary, mainly with the objective of securing some of the world's last remaining resources. When we think about world-famous insurgents, revolutionaries, etc., one thing we can be sure of, if they're trying to assume power, they don't go around bombing their own kind. Now, to understand this story a little bit more, we've got to go back to 2001, the year Samantha Lewthwaite converts to Islam. Now I know what you're all thinking. What the hell does 9/11 have to do with Samantha Lewthwaite? Well, the answer is this guy, Lucky Larry Silverstein. Most of you watching this video will probably know who this guy is. He's the guy who had the lease on the World Trade Center on 9/11. But he wasn't the only one to benefit from the massive insurance payout. Now we all know he received multi-billions, but what is not so widely known is that he wasn't the only one holding the lease. Another organization called the Westville Group America, they held the lease on the commercial space in the mall. Enter Frank Lowy. Now this guy is one of the top 200 richest people in the world, and there's a high likelihood that he owns a shopping mall near you. What's curious though, is the sheer amount of attacks, bombings, and other terrorist events that have happened in properties owned by Frank Lowy. So let's stop for a second and look at how many times his properties have been threatened with attack or actually attacked. 2005, Perth, Australia, bomb threat. 2006, Woden, Australia, bomb threat. 2007, Derby, England, bomb threat. 2008, Skokie, Illinois, bomb threat. 2009, Indiana, bomb threat. Then the Marriott in 2008 in Islamabad is actually bombed. Along in July of that year, the Marriott Hotel in Jakarta is also bombed. Which takes us to 2013 in Nairobi, Kenya, where we have the Westgate Mall terrorist attack. And this is where Samantha Lewthwaite is supposed to re-enter the story. Initially, the media is awash with stories of a veiled woman barking out orders. But as we can clearly see from the CCTV footage that's been released, there is no woman amongst the attackers. Instead, what we do see is 4 or 5 young Somalis with AK-47s. 4 or 5 young Somalis with AKs are able to hold off the combined might of the Kenyan Army, the UK Special Forces, Israeli commandos, as well as the US Special Forces, for days. In fact, it's not until the CCTV footage is released that mainstream media finally concedes that Samantha Lewthwaite is nowhere to be seen. So what we really should be asking ourselves here is, why was mainstream media so obsessed at putting her at the scene of the Westgate terrorist attack? Now, whilst there are a number of possible explanations, we should always be looking for the most simple explanation possible. And the simplest explanation is to divert attention, which leads us to the next question, which is to divert attention from what or from who? Perhaps simply just to divert attention from who actually owns the Westgate shopping mall. The mainstream media report that prior to the Westgate bombing, Samantha Lewthwaite was casing out another shopping mall called The Junction. So I suppose her days were spent wandering around the shopping mall, casing it out, and shopping. In the first few hours after the attack starts, the Kenyans get on the phone to the Israelis, who they have a not-so-secret defense agreement with. The Israelis would have called the Americans, and the Americans would have called the British, and everybody gets together in Nairobi for one huge anti-terrorist party. Reports quickly emerge of foreign special operatives being at the scene, as well as your standard issue, carefully placed, conveniently located, off-duty SAS operatives. It's also interesting to note how Reuters and other mainstream media are conveniently at the location to document this tragedy. When it quickly becomes apparent that she's not directly involved, mainstream media try and backpedal and airbrush her out. They come up with a number of ludicrous theories to explain why she's not present. Theory number 1 is that she's simply killed on site, but when no body can be found afterwards, this quickly collapses. Theory number 2 is she escapes down this service tunnel through 2 miles of human waste to be picked up in central Nairobi by her Al-Shabaab buddies. So despite the American, Israeli, and Kenyan military being present, nobody has a floor plan of the shopping mall. She's then taken to the coast of Kenya, up to the coast of Somalia, and into the heart of the Somali jungle. And apparently a lot of this is done in broad daylight on camels, with 4 kids. It gets more and more ridiculous. Mainstream media confidently reports that when she does get to her jungle hideout, there are 800 fanatical Al-Shabaab fighters waiting to protect her.
Does the UK have any new information about her? Let's discuss this and more with Britain's Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, who's joining us. Do you have any idea about her whereabouts right now?
No, of course we don't. Absolutely none. And, it is for Interpol to explain the alert that it is issued. I have no evidence linking her to the events in Nairobi. That is all still something that needs to be investigated.
So we have 2 real possibilities here. Option 1, she is a spy, and option 2, she is not. Let's recap and look at option 1. Could she really be a spy? So to begin with, she comes from a military counter-terrorist background. She's highly intelligent and articulate and attends SOAS University, popular with MI5 recruiters. She marries the most unlikely suicide bomber of all time, Jermaine Lindsay. It turns out that somehow she knows Mohammed Siddiq Khan, the ringleader of the July 7th bombings in London, codename Ibrahim. She exploits her husband's death and appears to have unlimited funds. There's no direct evidence of any terrorist activities whatsoever. She appears to know every terrorist in East Africa. And finally, and perhaps most tellingly, her movements across international borders are completely implausible. And it's these implausible international movements that we need to focus upon. Now, whatever you may think about Lee Harvey Oswald, one thing that cannot be denied is the implausibility of his international movements. At the height of the Cold War, an ex-Marine is allowed to defect to Russia, traveling through Finland, staying in expensive hotels. When he arrives in Russia, he spends 3 years in a plush apartment where he marries the daughter of a KGB colonel. He then decides to return to America and is completely ignored upon his return. When we look at Oswald and Lewthwaite, are we actually looking beyond the intelligence agencies to the hands that control them? The hands that facilitate these insane international movements? So if Samantha Lewthwaite is a cutout, a character created by the MI5 security agency, how long has she been working for them? Well, it's entirely possible that she's been working for them since a teenager. In fact, recently it came out that MI5 has been recruiting teenagers for many, many years. So it's possible she was recruited by MI5 at SOAS. And it's entirely possible that her father, who we hear very little about in the mainstream media, has far more contacts in the intelligence community than he is willing to admit. It's always been the case for the UK intelligence agencies that it's not a question of what you know, but who you know. And that's still very much the case today. Of course, another very real possibility is Samantha Lewthwaite was forced into working for MI5 after the July 7th bombings in London. If we think about it for a second, how difficult would it have been for MI5 to fabricate evidence suggesting that she was involved in the July 7th bombings along with her husband? The problem with this theory is we know she was involved in the July 7th bombings because she knows Mohammed Siddiq Khan. So if she was buddies with the ringleader of the July 7th bombings, was she friends with his friends? And if you're concerned at this point that everyone in this story seems to be a spy, well, check this out.
Harun Rashid Aswat. Aswat is believed to be the mastermind of all the bombings in London.
MI6 has been hiding him. Are you saying that he has been working for them?
Well, apparently Aswat was working for British intelligence.
So nearly everyone in this story does seem to have some connection with or to be working directly for MI5. And perhaps one of the few people that wasn't knowingly involved with MI5 was Jermaine Lindsay, Lewthwaite's first husband.
So what has happened to Martin McDade? Well, he disappeared from the Beeston area in 2005. Apparently shortly after this, he was teaching English at a private school in Oman, but from there the trail goes cold.
I've been told that he was very aggressive and he had some military experience, and then I've been told he vanished.
So Martin McDade gets to vanish, but Mohammed Siddiq Khan, he gets to vanish in an entirely different manner. Although he's a low-level foot soldier responsible for recruiting the other 3 guys, he still counts a member of parliament as a friend. On the night before the bombings, July the 6th, his wife is admitted to hospital about to deliver a baby, which presents Khan with a very large problem. Now, he thinks he's about to attend a highly well-paid terrorist drill, and he's recruited a number of his buddies to go with him. But if he can't make it, they're one short, which is how Jermaine Lindsay ends up being roped into all of this. It's a very strange triangle. You've got Lewthwaite, Khan, and Lindsay. The problem is there's absolutely no evidence that Khan ever met Lindsay or Lewthwaite. How exactly did these 3 know each other? Another serious red flag is Luthwaite's alleged involvement with Michael Adebelejo in Somalia. It makes an already suspicious crime look that much more suspicious. And then we have the problem of the funding or finance for all of this. We are not talking thousands, we are not talking tens of thousands of pounds or dollars, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions perhaps. There's the endless stream of high-end apartments. She'll need thousands for weapons, and let's not forget, she will not be immune to having to pay bribes. Now, originally, the official narrative says that the money is raised through sympathetic mosques, which is then channeled up to middlemen and intermediaries, and then somehow finally magically ends up in the hands of Samantha Luthwaite. Now, obviously, the logistics of doing this and organizing this are just simply too difficult for somebody who's on the run with 4 children. But if you'll pardon the pun, to try and explain the white elephant in the room, the mainstream media comes up with this theory: that Al-Shabaab are breaking into wildlife sanctuaries and poaching elephant tusk, which is worth more per kilogram than cocaine. And it's probably the only part of our story so far that has a shred of truth in it. Now, the backdrop to Samantha Luthwaite's involvement in Kenya is the low-level Chinese-American conflict that has been going on in Africa. So when the Kenyans become friendly with the Chinese via a number of trade agreements, this certainly doesn't make the Americans too happy. And there's a good argument that the entire Al-Shabaab fiasco that's going on in Kenya at the moment is really being backed by the Americans and British. And as we've mentioned before, it's really all about securing these natural resources. So that's option 1. Now let's have a look at option 2. She is a highly successful terrorist.
What is the current position, the knowledge on her involvement or not having any involvement with this shopping complex attack?
Absolutely nothing concrete whatsoever.
There is no evidence linking her to the Westgate complex attack, or any other terrorist attack for that matter. Because if there was any real evidence, she would be the most successful revolutionary, insurgent, terrorist, whatever you want to call them, since Che Guevara. Not only that, but she's managed to dupe MI5 and MI6 into believing that she had nothing to do with the July the 7th bombings. Furthermore, since leaving England in 2007, there are reports that she returned to England in 2009. So what on earth did MI5 and MI6 think that she was doing in Kenya for 2 years? The mass media keeps building up this bogey woman, but why? What's the real agenda here? This psychological operation serves many purposes, but one of its primary roles is to instill fear into the general population. After all, if Samantha Luthwaite, the girl next door, can be a terrorist, then the girl next door to you can be a terrorist, and by definition, you can be a terrorist as well. So it makes perfect sense then that you must be spied upon constantly and your civil liberties slowly removed. All of the stories concerning Samantha Luthwaite in the press may well be fiction, but the bodies and victims of this make-believe reality are real. Whether you're trying to unwind after a heavy day in Mombasa, or trying to struggle into work on the tube in London, you too can be a victim. In fact, it sounds like anyone could be a victim. So anyone can be a terrorist, and anyone can be a victim. Because this is the war of terror. The war of terror is the only war that there's ever been. It is the war of the state versus the people. And now that we live in a global society, the war of terror has gone global. It's gone fully global in its reach and fully global in its aims. So the government doesn't know what its foot soldiers are doing. The foot soldiers only answer to their facilitators, the Samantha Luthwaites and the Martin McDades of this world. The facilitators answer to the intelligence agencies, and the intelligence agencies answer to, well, that's the $64,000 question. Because they're no longer answering to national governments and their electorates. And it's also clear that the American, Israeli, and British intelligence have been acting as one unit since long before 2001. And as the apparatus of a global police state is set up right in front of our eyes, I can't help but think that the powers that be no longer care if we believe in these cover narratives. And if the general public are unwilling or unable to look up from their Android cell phones for 5 minutes to realize what's going on, does this mean that we're all actually to blame? To take one last historical example, was it Wall Street financiers and German industrialists who put Hitler into power? Or was it the ignorance and collusion of the German general public that put Hitler into power? Is the fantasy world of reality television and tabloid newspapers beginning to actually shape our perception of reality? Are people beginning to find it hard to distinguish between reality and television? As the corporate surveillance state grows ever larger, so do the cover stories and the lies. And if we have not already, we'll fully enter the world of Orwellian doublespeak and imaginary political hate figures. Because the London bombings were never fully investigated, we never really found out about Samantha Lewthwaite's role. And because we never found out about her role, 9 years later, she's still running around blowing people up, supposedly. So how does this fairy tale end? What is going to happen to Samantha? Well, considering we have no real proof that the old Samantha Lewthwaite even exists anymore, it's hard to say. But we can be fairly confident at this point that she's not going to be thrown over the side of an aircraft carrier. No, she'll probably be tracked to a New York apartment where she's happily engaged in an online shopping campaign. She may well be a high-level facilitator. In the end, though, it doesn't really matter, because there's only one possible ending for Samantha Lewthwaite.